Good evening. My name is Claudia Gordon. I'm the director of Villa Aurora.
And my name is Jakob Scherer. I'm the executive director of Villa Aurora and Thomas Mann House. We have a wonderful program coming up tonight, which is also the kickoff event of a 2-day conference. Arts in Times of Crises, the Role of Artists in Weakened Democracies. This conference will take place on Saturday and Sunday and will be organized by the sister organization of the Villa Aurora, namely the Thomas Mann House, which is located just a few miles down Sunset Boulevard. It will take place at the Red Cat Theater in downtown LA, as well as at the Thomas Mann House here in Pacific Palisades. And amongst the questions we will be dealing with are, must artists be activists? How should arts institutions navigate the culture wars? And what does an artist do when the world is on fire? Please let me share one last thought. When we started planning last night's event at the Thomas Mann House on bystanding and the Holocaust in Europe, tonight's reading and conversation on the Oppermanns, and our conference of the coming 2 days, no one could have anticipated the horrific attacks on Israel on October 7, the unimaginable suffering it brought to the victims and their families, and subsequently to civilians in the whole region. We, as Villa Aurora and Thomas Mann House, are deeply concerned about the flare-up and sharp rise in anti-Semitism and the threat to Jewish life worldwide. And we will resolutely oppose this development as part of our work. And so I think we believe it makes it even more important to have conversations such as the one tonight here in our space, in our safe space, on political arts. Back to you, Claudia.
Thank you. Tonight's program is very special because it brings Leon Feuchtwanger's Oppermanns to the house where he lived in exile from 1943 to 1958, which was his death. Feuchtwanger was, of course, as all of you know, known as a very staunch opponent of the Nazis and was on the very first list of people that lost their citizenship, and his books were burned also in Germany in the book burning. We will have tonight the privilege of hearing from Joshua Cohen, who revised and edited the English translation of the Oppermanns, and in his foreword called the book one of the last masterpieces of German Jewish culture. Joshua will be in conversation with Andrea Grossman of Writer's Block about the Oppermanns as Feuchtwanger's attempt to, quote, sound an alarm about the situation in Germany, political arts as propaganda, or in fact the only corrective to propaganda, and political novels, both contemporaneous and historical.
And before we start tonight's program, I would like to briefly talk about one of our guests of honor, Marianne Heuwagen. She's not only the deputy chairwoman of the board of directors of Villa Aurora and Thomas Mann House, she is also, if I may say so, the founding mother of the Villa Aurora as an artist in residence program. In the late 1970s, she started her friendship with Marta Feuchtwanger, and she conducted extensive interviews with Marta, which she compiled in the feature Ein halbes Jahrhundert im Exil, Half a Century in Exile. After returning to Germany in 1968 and Marta's death in 86 and Marta's death in 1987, Marianne dedicated herself to the preservation of Villa Aurora as a cultural monument of exile. To put it bluntly, without Marianne's tireless commitment, we wouldn't be sitting here tonight in the salon of the Villa Aurora, looking forward to hearing Joshua Cohen read from and talk about Leon Feuchtwanger's The Oppermanns. And dear Marianne, please come forward and share some of your thoughts and memories of the Villa Aurora with us.
Thank you very much, Jacob, for your very nice words. And I have been here in this room and in the salon next to it many times with Marta. And meeting her during my 8 years in Los Angeles was really, for me, the highlight of my times in the United States. I was a student who came for a year and ended up staying 11. But Marta, to me, speaking to her, talking to her, and hearing her vivid interest in modern Germany and modern German literature was really a wonderful experience. I particularly remember one little anecdote that I would like to share with you. Once I came to her house to return the manuscript of her biography. And we were sitting there in that little salon, and there was a lady from Munich visiting, upper-class lady with all the signs of prestige and wealth. And she started to complain about the lack of culture in the United States. And while I was thinking of how could I respond to this utterly ignorant view of a German woman, Marta very calmly said, you know, all your culture did not save you from Hitler either. And she was witty. She was alive until the very end, and she was very interested in taking people around the Villa Aurora. And this is what I did every time we had journalists visiting from Germany, like Michael Naumann or Volker Skirker, took them to the house, introduced them to Marta. And so after her death, we all came together to maintain this house as a cultural monument and also as a sign for us Germans born after the Second World War that we understood how much the German Jewish immigrants were a part of us and of our culture. This was something that was not very well known in Germany in the 80s. Now it's common knowledge, but at the time it was not. So we were grateful to the Berlin Senate and the Stiftung Klassenlotterie that we could purchase the house, and with the help of Frank Dimster, the wonderful architect who renovated it, to maintain it as this cultural monument that it still is today. And we are continuing what they have done, the German immigrants to Los Angeles, voluntarily in the sense that we exchange German or European and American culture. They did this because they had to. It was just their fate to had to leave Germany. We're doing it voluntarily, also as a thank you to the United States that took them in. So I hope you enjoy this evening with us tonight, and thank you very much for your attention. Have a nice evening.
Now it is my pleasure to give the floor to Andrea Grossman. She is the founder and president of Writer's Block, a literary series which is also like the Villa Aurora now in its 28th year. And the Villa and Andrea actually go way back, because back when the Villa was just starting out, Andrea Grossman was one of the people on our advisory board and helped us connect when we were still the new kids in town. So please welcome Andrea Grossman.
Reading the room, I have a feeling many of you have read Josh Cohen, but if you haven't read his books, you should. I love the Netanyahus so much, I can't even tell you. He's the author of several larger-than-life novels and collections, each acclaimed. The Netanyahus, his most recent novel, took home a Pulitzer and the National Jewish Book Award, and 1,000 other accolades. The great critic Harold Bloom rhapsodized about Joshua's collection, The Book of Numbers, placing Joshua amidst Philip Roth, Henry Roth, and Nathaniel West as writers of the 4 best books by American Jewish writers. As I read the Netanyahus, I kept thinking of Philip Roth, how the internal life of Cohen's characters matches the often hilarious and sometimes searing dialogue and exposition in his work. And when I was just talking to him, he told me that Philip Roth gave him his chair when he died. And so it gave him a backache, but his wife apparently has escaped the backache. And so anyway, see, I knew there was so much synchronicity here, but don't get a backache. The highest compliment I can offer about the Netanyahus is that it really does remind me of Philip Roth at his best. So read it. In addition to his personal literary output, he translated the Oppermanns by Leon Feuchtwanger. I want to thank Claudia for asking me here tonight and making me a fan of Feuchtwanger in general and the Oppermanns specifically. So there's so much to discuss, and we're going to get at it.
This book was a book that was, it was brought to me by a few different editors who actually wanted to bring it back. And right at the beginning of the Trump years, which is kind of when it was brought to me. And I treated it like, oh God, a translation job, which is just, you know, anyone who's done this, it's like, you know, charity and, you know, spend
Charity
months.
for a publishing company.
Yeah, and let's do something for a dead man and make no money at it and feel good about it. And I'm not even in academia, so it's like this is actually my time I'm wasting. So, you know, but then you think, you know, to be in his house and to talk about it in his house, it's an emotional experience. I mean, there is a narcissistic part of me that thinks after I'm dead, people coming to my house and someone's reading a book of mine, and like my response is, get out of my house. My response is like, what are these people doing in my place? But for him, it's been an interesting posterity that he's had to contend with, and there's just a hope that after maybe the success of this book, which has actually proven surprisingly successful, that there is some sort of a renaissance that brings people to his work and to this. But you wanted a summary of this entire book.
When was the last time this book was translated into English?
This book has a horribly messed up translation history that is fascinating. Do you want to hear about the book first or the translation history?
Up to you.
We can do a vote. We can be very democratic here.
Are we Democrats here?
We're Democrats.
We're Democrats
So very quickly, the story of the Oppermanns is intricately bound up with the story of its writing. I'm sure there are many people in the audience who knows this very well, so I'll kind of go very quick with it. It's this idea that Feuchtwanger was essentially asked to do a propaganda film that had the approval of the British government at the highest level of the British government, where it was going to be funded by the British government, and it was going to kind of expose Nazism for what it was. And he wrote the script in exile in France, as a refugee in France, and wrote it very quickly, or dictated it, as was his wont. And it was a story of that he had conceived in a bunch of different forms, but it was essentially a story of a wealthy bourgeois furniture makers and salespeople, a sort of a furniture dynasty that begins with the first generation that supplies troops in the Franco-Prussian War, and that sort of founds the Emanuel Oppermann, that kind of founds the dynasty. And then it becomes a solid, middle class furniture place that you would just buy.
With the worst slogan I've ever heard.
That Oppermann customers buy good goods cheaply.
Yeah.
That was their slogan. Yeah. Well, I can see its attraction, I guess. And at this point, there's one brother who runs the business. There is another brother who is a sort of a storied and renowned surgeon. And then there's the sort of central protagonist of the book, Gustav, who is the brother who's, he's the intellectual, he's also the womanizer, he's also he's the person who just wants to kind of finish his book about Lessing and leave me alone. And, what is this politics going on? I just want to write my book. And so it's about the fortunes of this family. One of the sister, there's three brothers and there's one sister. The sister is married in Ostjude, an Eastern Jew, a guy from Poland who also kind of pretends that he's French, which is interesting. And he's the one who says we have to get out of town. There's a daughter, Ruth, who is a Zionist, and that everyone kind of laughs at in the book. And it follows essentially this arc between in 33. It follows about 8-9 months, and he's writing the history of these 8-9 months in a period of 6 months. So he writes this entire book in 6 months about a period that just happened. There's actually a 3-month overlap between the period that is depicted in the book and the period of writing the book. And I should say that he wrote the book because the British who are sponsoring this screenplay decides that it's going to be too much of a provocation to Hitler, and so they cancel the screenplay. He throws a fit and he writes the novel. And he just says, I'm putting that as a novel.
And he writes the novel
In 6 months. In 6 months, and there's a few months overlap between the time depicted in the book and the time of writing. So his own library is being confiscated at the time that he's writing about libraries being confiscated. And so this is white hot, dictated to like 2 different sort of secretaries. And then the book attracts a huge amount of international notice. And there's a British version. There's an American version by James Klug that's done very quickly. And it's put out. It becomes enormously successful. It's a huge bestseller. Though there's problems with getting him the royalties from any of the stuff because in the meantime he has been interned as an alien, in a camp in France, which he then escapes from. But there is a quick and dirty early translation. Then there's a revised translation 10 years later. Then there's a further revised translation because, and we can get into this if people want to get into the weeds, there are 2 endings to this book. There's like the what I call the tragic ending, which is also the real ending, and then there is, which means it feels real to his spirit, and then there is an ending that tries for some interesting reconciliation, where Gustav meets a person who was a guard at a concentration camp that he was briefly interred in, and they kind of get together and learn how to be around each other again. And so there were multiple versions of one ending, multiple versions of another ending, and there was no real consensus on what the book was. So when you don't know really what the book is, you hire someone like me who doesn't know anything to just decide. Yeah, when you have like half the academics say this, the other half of the academics say this, you hire someone completely outside of the academy to make a fool of themselves. And it was a pleasure.
And you had read it before, in German or in English, in its various iterations?
I had read half of it in German before, and then I had read the Klug translation. And look, I think that I had been as familiar with Feuchtwanger as you kind of could be as a non-specialist in German Jewish literature. I mean, he wasn't part of the German canon. I mean, he isn't part of the German canon. Still to this day, he's not widely read in Germany. Also, he had really, I write about this in the intro, he had these 2 modes which were so weirdly opposed, right? Where these 2 modes are writing these historical novels about Josephus and the Roman sack of Jerusalem and about the Jew of Toledo, which is about 15th century Iberia, or then his books about he has these series of books that are also about the 18th century. There's Yud Sus, which is and then he has these books that are set like on the day that he's writing them, which is just, it's insane to be a historical novelist and then a real-time transcriber of events.
Especially those events.
Yes.
Where where his characters are being run out of town and their books are being burned and confiscated. And can you, what do you think about how does someone get the courage to do that? I mean, what he did was, when he was writing the screenplay, he wrote the screenplay first, right? And it's real time. It's real time.
Yeah, I think that he is just groping for some purchase on the world changing. I think that there are. This is something that I've experienced at a very, very low level, and so I can only kind of extrapolate from my own feelings of what is the purpose of writing in the face of events. And I think that in general, there are these 2 very opposed responses. One is that the writer says, writing is slow, it's some sort of it's an intellectual digestive system in a way. Like it you know, I mean, and I when I say that, I really do mean to almost point out its relationship to shit, right? It takes things in and it turns it into waste sometimes. But the idea that it's slow, that you have to consume these things and allow them to be, you know, melted down and to distill their essence. But there's this sense that literature will take its time. And then there are the other people who, the moment that something happens, their way of responding to it or dealing with it is to immediately treat it as subject. And I think that, I don't know that it's courage, I think that it's survival. I think that it's in order to understand my world, someone who gains power through understanding, right? Their concept of power, and I think Feuchtwanger's concept of being powerful was to understand the situation, was to know the truth, was to be able to see past not just propaganda, but also the lies that one tells oneself against the propaganda. I think this was his way of coping, processing it.
A long time ago, Writer's Block, my literary series, hosted the great English novelist A.S. Byatt, whose death was announced today, as a matter of fact. And I asked, and her father, she told me that her father was a judge or somehow involved. Her father was a Queen's Counsel in England, and he was somehow involved in the Nuremberg trials. And I asked her, why did it take so long for novels about the Holocaust to be written? Why was it not until the late 50s, early 60s that we really started seeing big examples and great examples of English fiction regarding the Holocaust, or American fiction? And she said, oh, writers couldn't possibly do it earlier because we had to process all that. So what you're saying is directly in opposition, that it took, because she said it took so long to process such a cataclysmic, you know, world event.
I mean, I would even go farther than that and say that there are only, to my mind, there are fewer than 10 novels really written, you know, I don't just mean like good novels, I mean novels that are written by survivors of concentration camps. Like, you know, Adler, Fred Wander, you know, they really can be counted on two hands. And I think that, you know, Wiesel, if you consider there are 2 or 3 novels there. But, and I think that, yeah, there is something about the time it takes to do that. I mean, you mentioned Nuremberg, and you know what I was reminded of is probably the greatest novelist of that experience at its height was Yechiel Dinor, who, you know, wrote under his concentration camp number, his Katzetnik number, right? And who was a witness at the Eichmann trial, and you know, famously is brought up to testify at the Eichmann trial. And you know, they swear him in, and they ask him if he was, you know, an inmate of, you know, Auschwitz, and he says yes. And then he asked, you know, just in a very kind of procedural question, and where was Auschwitz located? And he said, well, it was on another planet that was near the moon, and then he passes out. And he doesn't revive for the rest of testimony. And I think that this is, you know, I think that absolutely it's not just it's a question of block. And so in a way, Feuchtwanger he got out in a time when one could still write, you know, where I think that the faculties that are necessary for writing, with the ability to kind of take in information, process it, and to remember how it used to be. Because part of that writing process is not just seeing what is, but it's being able to compare it to what was. And that was one of the last moments. And I think that anyone who kind of was around beyond that, their fundamental apparatus of perception is damaged in a way, or changed. So Sybil, you should know this is Gustav. This is his 50th birthday, and he is having as I think one should at 50, irrespective of the Nazis. 50 is bad, right? 50 depressed. I mean, this is kind of his whole point is like, don't talk to me about politics, I'm 50. And all he wants to do is finish his essay on Lessing, which is just going on forever. And he doesn't want to deal with his brother, and he doesn't want to deal with any of these visitors who are trying to tell him that it's his birthday, including his lover, Sybil. Sybil took her departure with the rest. Her shabby little car came in for the jesting comments it always did. As soon as the others were out of sight, she drove back. She had promised Gustav to spend a little more time with him alone. The room was full of smoke. Schluter and Bertha had gone to bed. The temporary staff had left. They went out onto the terrace overlooking the garden. It was very cold. There was a cloudy moon. The Grunewald pines stood stiff and motionless. Sybil was astounded at the change in the view, but Gustav knew it in every phase. He shivered in the chill evening air. They turned back and soon went to bed. Gustav, Sybil's long, narrow head on his breast, lay tired and happy. Yawning at peace, he told her for the fourth time how glad he was that the contract for the Lessing biography had given him a task for the ensuing year. Sybil lay awake. As she wanted to get home before daybreak, it was not worth going to sleep. As though he were a stranger, she looked at the sleeping man with curiosity, without pity. Did he really believe that the Lessing biography was a task? It would certainly be a thick volume. There was already a slim little volume by Friedrich Wilhelm Gutwerder called The Prospects of White Civilization. Sybil pouted her lips scornfully, like a naughty child. She got up and dressed, shivering a little, quietly. Gustav slept on. She went into the study. She had left her handbag lying there. On the desk lay a lot of papers covered with writing. Sybil was an inquisitive girl. She rummaged about among them. She found a postcard. "Dear Sir," the postcard said, "take note of this for the rest of your life. It is upon us to begin the work. It is not upon us to complete it. Yours very sincerely, Gustav Oppermann." So, I wanted to read that little bit because that postcard, which is a card that Gustav writes to himself on his 50th birthday to remind, kind of keep him on track. It's a message that then shows up in 3 or 4 other places in the book and has a different meaning sort of every time. And what I like about that line is, and I think this was Feuchtwanger's point in using it, is he uses it almost as a central concept of classic German Bildung, of this idea of this is a tradition of self-cultivation, and it is not upon you to complete the work. You just have to begin it, right? You just have to become involved with it. And it's this idea that you are being part of a tradition and that your life exists within a continuum of a tradition. And I think what Feuchtwanger liked about this line, which he uses, is that it's a line from Rabbi Tarfon that is found most famously in Pirkei Avot in the Talmud. And it really is a line that is intended, Tarfon is from the generation directly before the Roman destruction of the temple. And it's a line about essentially a messianic impulse. This idea of, you might not be there for the end times, but you must work toward this messianic redemption. And what was interesting with Feuchtwanger is that he very much connected it to this drive of German Jewry to connect itself to German culture, to in some ways make themselves into a self-appointed apotheosis of that culture that then becomes utterly, bereft when it finds out that it's not considered part of that culture. And when that line comes back again and again, it gains an irony and tragedy as it goes on. And it's especially interesting because the word that Tarfon uses, that you find in Talmud, is a work that is the word for work there is a word that's used for both like handicrafts, malacha, like it's used for like making something with your hands, but it's also it also has like a higher idea of like messianic resonance because it relates to kings and angels in its root, whereas Feuchtwanger, when he uses the translation of it, and he uses a number of different translations of it in different times, including a Buber version of it, that counterpoints Arbeit and Werke, and this two notions of work, whether it's sort of, work as the labor, right? Everyone, that is infamous through, that work makes you free, that you would find at the gates of Auschwitz, but work as in labor or work as in in artwork, and so the tension between labor and artwork, and the idea that one is dedicated to a work that is uncompletable, I think is for him, it seems very personal in the way he uses it.
Will you repeat that? It was like a mantra to me while reading the book. What is it again?
Well, in the way that he has done it, in the way that he presents it, it is, it is upon us to begin the work. It is not upon us to complete it. And the kind of original one is the more literal translation would be, it is not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you free to neglect it.
So that brings us right back to the subject of tonight, which is art in the time of crisis, right? So can you talk about that mantra in terms of an artist's duty, an artist's intent, if you're setting out to write or paint or compose something that can change the world?
Yeah. I mean, I think that most of the time writers have no idea what they're doing, and when they say they're doing something, they're really absolutely doing something else. And I think it's very necessary for them when I used to go to a shrink, they always said, use the first person. So I should say, it's very necessary for me. I should own this. I should personalize this, right? It's very necessary for me to think that I'm doing something else, right? Because I know that my true intentions will be revealed. I think that when Feuchtwanger is beginning this, I think he's writing this as a piece of propaganda, and I think he needs to make money, and I think he believes in it. And I think at a certain point, he's telling himself he needs to write a book that sounds an alarm. And so he writes the book. It sells almost 1 million copies, right, in the first couple years that it's in print, which is astounding. And yet it doesn't stop anything. The war goes on, right? I mean, it stops nothing. So in an idea, he writes a book to stop things, to sound an alarm, and what he's ended up doing is writing a masterpiece, which isn't bad, to fail in one objective but succeed in another. I think that there are. I would look for maybe contrary examples of people who set out to write masterpieces and all they did was make a big political mess. I think that in a lot of ways the activist impulse is maybe what a writer needs to begin writing, especially in times when it feels that literature is pointless, that literature is meaningless. What is literature going to do? What does it mean in the face of all of this opposition? I think that you need to have some sort of narcissistic hero complex to think that if only they read the truth, like if only they really knew, and if that's what it takes to get writing down on the page, then okay, at least the writing's down on the page.
And the truth is in fiction. I mean, I have always said that I learned so much more about what's happening in a given moment, in a given time, about anything from fiction, because we can get into the heads, we can, of people, we can find out what's going on. When you were translating the Oppermanns, did you find, looking at that through the lens, looking at the events of the world of 1933 through the lens of fiction, what did you feel?
Wow, I think it's really tough. I think, I had on one hand these publishers who were saying, and this was the beginning of the Trump administration, and was saying, this is the book we need to read now, right? And a part of me said, sure, okay, makes sense, let's do it now. I mean, we need to read it now more than we needed to read it during the first years of the George W. Bush administration. I don't know, okay, we need to read it now, okay. And a part of me was very much behind that idea. Another part of me was very, very wary about translating, translating from one language to another, especially something that is written in an accessible, colloquial way, you find the way to talk and you find the language for it. But translating the terms of one conflict or political situation to another is, it's very good marketing for a book. It's also very dangerous.
So,
And so, for example, I think a lot about, there was that time in the early Trump administration where saying, we're living in the 30s now. And it's like, the more you say that, the more it feels like we are,
Right.
I feel that there are lots of attempts to always transpose one historical perspective or one historical conflict into terms. I also think that's something that America is astoundingly adept at, where we take conflicts from abroad or from history and we translate them into local terms. One of the things that we've seen in the last month, is you take Israel-Palestine, right, which has, you want to find a set of more fucked up politics. Good luck, right? But you have this set of deeply defined and locally ingrained politics, and when they come to America, they become translated into American racial political terms, where suddenly, Palestinians are people of color and Jews are white people, right? And so, America has a deep appetite for taking historical conflicts and foreign conflicts, and in order to internalize them into our own political discussion, which is very myopic and in some ways doesn't necessarily care about the fate of the rest of the world, just wants to know how the rest of the world will affect us domestically, we translate things. And so a part of me was very wary about making a certain translation. It's like, if we do this, am I calling Trump Hitler? I mean, I don't want to do that. So one of the things that I was trying to do was trying to not say this is the book we need to read now. I would say this is the book you need to read at all times.
every 4 years.
Well, sure. Well, I mean, now that elections take fully 4 years, we start electing the next person, right away. But yeah, so I mean, that to me was a thing. From a translational point of view, though, if we were talking now about just strictly how do you move the sentences over, I have to say that reading this book made me realize something very intense and I hope useful in my own work, which is that no one writes about the present. I don't know if anyone knows, they don't even make movies about the present anymore. And it's like the present doesn't exist. The present has stopped existing. The degree of historical novels, the amount of historical novels that are out there is, I would say most novels are historical novels now. Films are set on alternate universes. People are superheroes. It's some solar system that you don't know. But to actually find a movie set in the present with normal people doing something that happens in the present, good luck. They're few and far between. And reading this book set in its own present, written in its own present, sort of answered my question about why do we have this present fear now, or why can't we? Why does the present almost not seem to exist? And I think that part of the answer this book gave me was this idea that the present is always this, we know what's happening on a level of who is doing what, but we never know what it means, which is why realism has always had a political dimension, right? Realism, and naturalism, especially, which is supposed to be the description of reality as through the description of systems, was always this idea of showing what is happening in our present time through representative characters, right? This character is your Democrat. This character is your Republican. This character is your, rapacious business person. This character is your, beggar in the gutter. And we are going to use these characters as, conduits or channels for political speech or for political, discussion. And at a certain point, those naturalistic attempts of realism became seen by people as overdeterminative and symbolic, overly symbolic, and writers discarded them, and people were no longer representative people. And one of the problems now is it's very hard to write about characters now and to know what they mean, because writers have given up this idea of someone symbolizing or incarnating something. And at the same time, we don't necessarily understand how to deal with political meaning or political valence outside of that symbolic conceit.
In your foreword, you said that when the Oppermanns came out in 1933, American readers rejected the realism as propaganda. You said something like that.
Some of them did, yeah. I mean, absolutely.
Has that changed, do you think?
You're saying, asking if American readers have gotten better?
In fiction. Yeah, reading fiction.
Yeah, American readers have gotten. No, I think there was a reaction to the book that was specific to the book, and then certainly the reaction in the books in the aftermath of its publication was a reaction more to Feuchtwanger's politics and the general McCarthy era, anti-communist discrimination that he suffered, that prevented him from publishing, prevented him from getting an American passport, and largely contributed to a depression that hurt his writing. I think that from my perspective, what has changed really again is what is the use of reality. People think that realism is just writing down what you see in front of you. But of course, the moment that you do that, you realize that what you see is conditioned politically by who you are, right? And I think that the 19th century mode of making symbolic people or making people to be conduits of political ideologies or of types, right, is something that is highly out of fashion now. But this book is very much in that tradition. He was always in some way a hangover 19th century novelist, right? I mean, I mean that in a respectful way of someone coming from a Balzacian tradition, someone coming from a Tolstoyan tradition, and that is just there's a way in which when the novel now attempts to encounter the individual, where what is prioritized is getting to know an individual in all their complexity, it seems like it becomes harder and harder to write a political novel, because you can no longer dramatize. You no longer have the vehicle to dramatize an abstract idea.
I want to talk about. I'm not aware of what time we started, so I want to be mindful of that.
1933.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I know we've been going on for 90 years. Okay. So I want to just address a few things before we take some questions. In terms of moving the needle or making change in art, I do want to address something that Jakob said, and that's about artists being activists. Do artists need to be activists? Talk about that.
Artists can do whatever they want.
Right.
I don't know. For me, again, I think it's far more complicated than this. I think that part of the question presupposes the idea that when an artist sets out to do something, that when they actually do it, it's what they originally set out to do. There are plenty of artists who set out to be activists, and along the way they make something, right? And I think that there are also many artists who set out to be like chicken farmers, and on the way they set out, they get something done. I think I think for me, it's about what is necessary to convince myself that that what I'm doing is necessary. And sometimes that's political, sometimes it's not. But I always know that whatever that calling is, it's an essentially superficial, not excuse, it's a superficial spur to my writing. Because unless there is that thing that I can, it's a horrible process of delusion. I have to convince myself that my writing should exist, that it's important to someone, and that it's worth sitting down and doing. And, and all appearances, maybe perhaps to the contrary, I'm not that much of an egomaniac to really think that the world cares every day what I think about something. And so, you need to then develop strategies in order to elicit that writing from you. And so some of that is political, absolutely. And I think political is probably the most popular one, I would say.
And then there's this one, while I was reading the Oppermanns, something kept, but I want to get to my Bertolt. Bertolt is a character in this book. Oh my God. Bertolt is the son of the brother who runs the furniture company that makes cheap furniture or whatever that slogan is. But this great stalwart company, and Bertolt is a senior in high school, and he's getting a classical education. He's watching the world fall apart in front of him, and he seems to be one of the only characters who isn't in denial about what's going on the streets around him. And he says he's in despair and he's distraught about something that happens at school with a Nazi teacher. And he says, he picks up a book or a poem comes to mind, and then he says, now is not the time for prose. Now is not the time for poetry.
No, yeah.
What happens when something like an art form goes out of fashion like that? What happens when that no longer suits the needs of our time?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you're trying to make me depressed here?
Never.
No, I
you
just...
made me depressed for
I don't,
2 weeks.
Yeah. I mean, I think... I'm very suspicious. I'm very suspicious is too polite. But whenever anyone says, it's not the time for something, my immediate thing is, it's exactly the time for that. It's just bullshit. It's just, and I'm with it. It's not the time for comedy. It's absolutely the time for comedy. It's not the time. It's always the time for what someone thinks it's not the time for, period. And what you're talking about is audience, maybe. Whereas I think what Bertolt is talking about is he has to write an essay, and he has to write an essay about Arminius and about this was talking about challenges in translation. He has to write a paper about this ancient Teutonic general, this kind of very ancient German history. Stuff I know nothing about. I'm on Wikipedia. I'm is this a guy who did a thing in the 5th century? And then after this horribly stultifying essay, which he has to write, to satisfy this school teacher, he's going through poetry, and he's kind of has to memorize a poem, and I think what he's talking about is this idea that poetry doesn't feel, that the poetry that he's reading doesn't. It's not equal to his emotional moment in a way. He's not reading the poetry that he needs. And I tend to hear it that way. I tend to hear it that way in which, we have these moments and it's you go to war with the culture you have, sort of. And there's a moment where everything that came before is insufficient. And I can imagine that a character like him, who is in the situation that he's in, what does he reach for when he is in a point of emotional, he's almost suicidal, right? when he's at
Almost.
this, yeah. Well, I don't want to ruin things for people, but
Wouldn't dream of it.
yeah. But when he has this moment, what does he reach for? In a moment of comfort, he reaches for poetry in German, which is, he feels is the language that has betrayed him. So it's the language that's going to give him comfort is also the language that he feels betrayed in, where he gets into grammatical fights with his teacher, with his professor, right? And so, but if you're talking about just what has, power now, or what has, sway, I don't think that poetry, thank God, ever had that much power.
Like protest songs had a lot of power in the 60s and 70s. Those moved the world, right? I mean,
That's what they tell me.
Yeah, well, they did.
Yeah,
I'm telling you, Josh.
Sure, that's what they tell me. They did, yeah.
All of us here.
They did, yeah. I mean, I think I can see that, but I guess what I'm also saying is that the real literature, I think, of a people, and I'm including songs, and I think it really is something that is that's only evident sort of after the fact, in the way that, like, in the same way that when this book came out, it was really seen and it was marketed. It was like this scandalous expose, like, you must hear the truth. It was and it was done in those tones that made entire generations of readers think, you know what? He's not Musil. He's not Kennedy. He's not Hermann Brock, right? He's a cheap, sensationalist novelist who writes things in bright colors, right? And I think it actually affected his reputation. And it kind of prevented him from being seen as a master, in a certain way. And so I think it's taken decades, right, for the sensationalistic and journalistic aspirations of this book to fall by the wayside, and for it now to be read as the masterpiece it is. That not only should it stand next to, Kennedy's Auto da Fe, not only should it stand next to Brock's The Sleepwalkers, but it should stand, at least in my mind, above at least one of them, one and a half of them, and which, by the way, those books that I'm mentioning are all books written between 31 and 35, right? And so, I think that in a way, the journalistic aim, the raising the alarm, which didn't work in this case, didn't stop the war, it also became it typed him, it stereotyped him as a novelist, and didn't allow him to be, let's say, given that same serious consideration that his peers were.
I think that's a perfect place to stop.
Are there any questions from the audience?
There really don't have to be. Don't worry about my feelings. I stopped feeling a long time ago.
Well,
There's a
can you say something about how is the book selling in the United States and how was it perceived?
This version of it. So it came out, and I think, and it was strange. We didn't really know what was happening. It was sort of coming out. It was COVID, and so it was kind of weird to know about things. And then Pamela Paul, who has a column at the New York Times, called me about it and said that she had read it and was writing something about it. And then the next thing I know, they excerpted a version of the introduction in the New York Times, and then it sold really well, and then we had to. Then you have to like tell Amazon not to. Amazon for a while was funny because it didn't have enough copies in stock, so they were sending people who ordered the book German copies. And so if you look online at the Amazon page, one of them, someone just like gave it 1 star and was like, I'm sure it's a good book, but they send it to me in German, which I love. But no, it did. It did fairly well. I think that one of the goals with this was to figure out how to do the entire late trilogy, of which this is, the middle volume, and so the hope is that they'll be able to do the the entire trilogy, which would be great, and so I think the idea would be to do, I think the first volume, meaning the first volume of the trilogy, this is the second, would be, I think, early 2025.
He wrote it in 27 to 29.
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and before the rise of the Nazis.
Yeah.
But he called the Nazis criminal in that book.
Yeah.
He wrote it in Berlin, yes.
So I think that will come out in 2025, and then the third volume would be maybe the year after that. I don't know. I don't make these decisions. People far more important than I make these decisions. So hopefully at some point, yeah.
Yeah, let's continue the conversation during our reception. But before we close, I have one last very important remark. Please join me in a round of applause for the wonderful Villa Aurora team. Friedel Schmoranza, and Betty Herrera. Without them, this would not have been possible. So thank you so very much, and please stick around and take an opportunity to talk to our presenters, our artists, and to each other. Thank you.